One of the most visible changes in the shift that we are seeing today is the redesign of the traditional workforce pyramid. As GCCs in India transition from execution hubs to strategic, innovation led centers, the underlying talent model is being fundamentally redefined. The question is no longer how many people organizations can hire, but how much capability they can build into the workforce they already have. Hello, everyone. You're listening to Industry Wide Conversations, your front row seat to founder journeys, leadership insights, and the real stories behind how industries run. Now, this transition reflects a broader repositioning of GCCs from support functions to strategic partners embedded in core business outcomes. Instead of executing predefined tasks, they are increasingly expected to co create solutions, influence decision making, and drive innovation. Let's welcome Divesh Agarwal, founder and CEO of Omni, to discuss how cultural change and talent is redefining work in the GCC. Hi, Divesh, how are you doing?
Hi, Priya. Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Likewise, Devesh, a warm welcome to our podcast today. And it's a pleasure to have you on our podcast. And of course, I think we are going to talk a lot about your journey, about the overall GCC industry, and what are certain things we should keep in mind in terms of talent retainment in the era of GCC and what cultural changes we should keep in mind. So let's get started. And initially, of course, we would want to know more about Omni. So, a little brief about Omni, its journey and specialization would be great.
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, Priya, I can start with my background, and I think
Sure.
that will reflect into how, Omni came into being.
Yeah.
So I'm originally from Mumbai, did my engineering in 1996 from Mumbai. And that was around the time when the Indian outsourcing industry had just about begun, right? In fact, my first job was, the offer that I got was around Y2K, meaning there was a lot of code which was written in COBOL, had to be fixed so that the dates, date format can be changed. So that was very simple, replace and fix kind of outsourcing work happening that time. But nevertheless, so I graduated there. I worked in Mumbai for a couple of years. Everyone at that time was kind of moving. There was a huge brain drain that time because not many product companies, not many software companies in India that around that time. So people were, looking for greener pastures, and me being one of them, moved to the US. Lived in the US for about 12 years. Moved back in 2012 to Pune. And during my stint in the US, for one of the companies that I used to work for, they were very interested in setting up their first, we call it GCC now, but in those days we used to call it ODC, so Offshore Development Center. So back in 2003, I had come down to India, Pune, set up the GCC, the first GCC, my life's first GCC. And over the years, that GCC became a game changer for that company that I used to work for. It grew very fast with the company, and one of the things we did right at that time was not use the offshore development center only for low task or low impact deliverables. We used it for very complex stuff. Everything that the US office was doing, these guys were doing here, right? So that became a game changer. And in 2013, that company sold for $1 billion, and this GCC was the game changer in that valuation of the company. After that, I moved out of that company, started Omni in 2016. And one of the reasons I started Omni with this model was to basically create the same magic I was able to do for that company, for other companies, because I thought there are many small to mid-sized companies that want to use India's talent, the cost arbitrage, the scale that we can move, right? But they don't have the right partner or the right people to use that. Obviously, there are a lot of companies, large companies, small companies doing outsourcing, project-based outsourcing, but many companies are now looking for their own team, their own people who can be with them for a long time. They can take responsibility, ownership. So Omni came into being into 2016, 10 years ago, to just offer that as a service, which means we build teams offshore teams, product teams that work with the clients directly, make a difference, and at some point they can convert into GCCs. So, GCC as a service, or what I call it as a global accelerator center or a global advantage center more than GCC, because these teams that we have built about for last 10 years, about 400 people across teams, are making a huge difference to all our clients in terms of product engineering, in terms of responsibility, and the valuation of those companies. One other aspect that I have also observed in the last 20 odd years of working in creating GCCs in India is the culture shift. In the 90s, it was more about for the tech industry, for the tech talent to just about get any job. Any job that's in the private sector was okay, because it was paying more and it had more things to learn and stuff like that, right? In the 2000s, it became about I want to work for brands, work for big companies, good salaries, a lot of on-site opportunities. People used to ask, will the company send me to the US or, UK, stuff like that. And then in from 2010 to 20, I think the landscape has changed. Now, the younger talent in India is no longer, only looking for on-site visits. They are looking to innovate. They're looking for a culture where they can, grow with the company, build something interesting. And now we're talking about, AI coming into picture. So the quality of talent in India has changed a lot. So, me being seeing this for last, 30 years, I think that's my take on the talent.
That's a fascinating overview, Devesh, and thank you for, sharing that. And it sets the stage for everything we are going to explore next. And I'm really glad to understand how your journey has been till date and how it reflects a balance between vision and adaptability. I think it also gives our audience a solid understanding of not just what you do, but why it matters in today's landscape. Great. So moving ahead, of course, when we talk about GCCs, GCCs employed over 2.1 million professionals in India and has contributed around 2% of the country's GDP. And they have evolved from cost savings back offices in the 90s to strategic hubs shaping enterprise decisions today. And by 2025, more than 1,700 GCCs were based in India, generating around $76 billion in value and accounting for 55% of the global GCC landscape. So, how has the role of GCCs, evolved over the years, and what exactly is driving this transition of GCCs from being just an execution centers to now becoming strategic innovation hubs?
Yeah, good question. I think your numbers are bang on. I think it's a market that is very rapidly growing, and it is going to grow much faster. I think the shift that I was talking about earlier, there are two or three different factors that have come into play. One is the situation in the West, where most of the work, comes to India. There have been visa constraints. There have been, policy changes. So a lot of Indians who would travel or, move to the West has not been happening for the last few years. So there is a talent deficit, if you will, in the Western countries. So they are looking, now to utilize this talent in some way or some form. The most obvious form is to outsource projects, which I think many companies are still doing and will continue. But I think a big chunk of the companies or the corporations in the US are now looking at how they can establish long-term relationship with the talent in India. And for that, you need to have a vehicle, and that vehicle we are now calling as a GCC, wherein, like you said, it's not just about a cost center. It is not about just, following orders. It's also about, bringing in innovation and driving growth from India at a reasonable cost, right? And scale. Because, people talk about India as a cost arbitrage, but with our clients, we always talk also about the scale and also about the quality. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, the quality of Indian professionals was lacking, because we did not have that exposure. But now with 2 or 3 decades of exposure to the West, so much travel, people coming back from the Western countries, setting up shops here. I think the professionalism has caught up with the West. So you see, you can get the same or similar quality in India at a reasonable cost, and you can scale faster. So if you want to, like, hire, let's say, 200 people, 300 people in New York or in, California, it's going to take months. A year, you can do it in weeks, right? So that's, all these different factors come into play, and I think that's driving the growth here in India for GCCs.
Right, and that's a great perspective, Devesh. And definitely it highlights, just how far GCCs have come in their journey. Initially it started as a cost arbitrage driven back office operations, and now it has become into something far more dynamic and influential. So I think GCCs of today, even if we talk about particularly in India, they are not just supporting global enterprises, but they are actively shaping business outcomes and driving innovation and also leading digital transformation agendas from the front.
That is right.
That, yeah, that being said, I think, of course, we understand that the journey has been pretty much revolutionary enough that, GCCs in India have pretty much matured. And, they're now seen as a catalyst or centers of capabilities for driving innovation or strategic capability development. Nevertheless, I think this transformation also requires a foundational shift in people, processes, and also the overall culture, especially in how talent thinks, works, and collaborates. So, what kind of mindset shift is required for professionals in GCCs to thrive in this new environment?
Yes, excellent question. I think this goes back to our education system, to our cultural upbringing. I think those are two foundational things that may have to change, going forward in terms of, being very global. Because I think India for long has been, task execution mindset, right? The chalta hai attitude or the jugaad attitude, right? Where we, do something and it reaches 90% or it works till 90% and we are happy or we are satisfied that, at least it's working. But in the global scene, that is not good enough, right? The expectation is 100%, right? To take it to 100%. And I think that's where the mindset of our professionals will need to change from a task executor to thinking yourself as an entrepreneur or enterprise owner mindset, right? Where you own something, you own a task. It's not about my boss has given me this, I'm delivering it this, and I'm done, right? No, you should understand the context of the task, what impact is going to make, how long it's going to take, and own the task or the overall, initiative and deliver that. I think that's where I think the shift will help the Indian landscape and people and our country becoming more from a services driven country to an innovation led country. I think that's where I would think the mindset needs to change.
I agree with you, Devesh. And I think today's talent, it's not just about having technical expertise, it's about how these professionals think, adapt, and evolve with the ecosystem around them. And I think that's where, cultivating a global mindset comes into picture, where, they're able to kind of navigate the cultural nuances, ensure and embrace continuous learning so that they're relevant and they are aligned with the current trends and they can think beyond local boundaries. And I think the future, if we talk about GCCs, how it is going to evolve is that it's going to focus not just on the skills of these professionals, but also the overall mindset, how they're adaptable, proactive, and deeply aligned with business impact.
That is correct. Yeah. So, that is the only thing that's going to give long-term value, right? Because other than that, if you just, focus on finishing tasks or, then it's just a short-term thinking and that doesn't lead anywhere.
Yeah,
So
yeah, true. So, you spoke about, developing a cultural, ensuring that there is a culture within the organization that can support these professionals to, shift their mindsets. How do you think that, GCCs can build this overall culture where they can encourage more innovation and ownership?
I think GCCs, the culture shift has to be from, I think globally, it has to be not just in India. I think it has to be done globally, and it is happening more and more now, where the teams must be empowered for decision making. They should align the KPIs of the GCCs to have to the business impact, not to the individual department or the small rewards. Right, it has to align to the what business impact of the global organization and reward initiatives, reward innovation, right? Because we see a lot of GCCs falling into the prey of, trying to retain talent and, sometimes rewarding flawless, justice execution or, happy with just, big stuff being done. But is it done right? Is it having an impact to the global organization? What is the downside 3 years or 4 years? What's going to give you, right? So I think that's where the culture shift has to happen, more accountability in the center. So that's one thing. And second is the work environment, right? Thinking about the newer generation as Gen Zs, as we call them, right? You know, people now a lot of newer talent, they need to see a vibe in the office, right? So even your office structure or overall how it feels when you are at work or not at work, right? Is there a vibe, for a better term, at the workplace, right? So, more collaboration centers, more collaborative areas, breakout areas, less cabins, more people sitting together. I think a lot of that has to come together for GCCs to able to foster that kind of growth and that innovation mindset.
Right, Devesh. And honestly, I think a much needed shift for GCCs that want to go beyond, being just execution engines is to, fostering and creating and ensuring that they are, promoting more true value creators. And I think we need to create an environment where people can feel safe to experiment and they can balance between freedom and accountability. And I think that's where real transformation happens. And I think GCCs that succeed in building this kind of culture don't just deliver efficiently, but they kind of start influencing global strategy, driving innovation, and shape the future of the enterprise.
That's right. Yeah. For example, in our office space, we when we hire people, we tell them, the काम हमारा भगवान है, so work is our God.
Yeah.
But so you need to treat that very, religiously, and then do anything you want. So you live your college lives here, right? So we all have had our best times in our engineering or graduation, whatever we've done undergrads. I think so. We have successfully, able to implement that kind of environment here, where it's just just feel free. There is no micromanagement. There is no someone asking for the questions, why you leaving or why you playing table tennis or football in the middle of the day, right? So that kind of freedom, if you have that kind of culture, I think it fosters that free mindset to innovate.
Right. And I think, with what you said, I just wanted to add that I think leaders today also should no longer ask or, think about how to recruit top talent. I think they should ask about how to build environments where, people choose to stay and grow and contribute over the long run, because I think it's important that talent eventually is one of the most decisive drivers of economic growth, and it's important that we attract and retain talent in an environment where the skilled workers have more choice and mobility than ever before. So having said that, Devesh, what are certain strategies that we can implement in terms of attracting and retaining talent?
Yeah, I think one is I think the talent today requires meaningful work, right? So it's not about just about getting a job. People, when they're coming now, for interviews, they're asking, and it's a good thing. People are asking, okay, what am I going to actually working on? What impact I'm going to make? What's my future? 2 years, 3 years down the line. So I think with GCCs need to be able to provide that meaningful work for the talent, continuous upskilling, collaborative, environment where you're not just a person in a team sitting there in meeting rooms, endless meetings, and not asking questions. I think you need to be in there. Your idea should be welcome. You're sitting there, you're free to ask questions, free to give your ideas. And if your ideas are not accepted, someone should justify them that, why they're not accepted. So I think that kind of culture plus upskilling, talking about AI, which I'm sure you have a question down the line, but like for example, AI is no longer a choice. People need to use AI. So we are looking at upskilling everyone to use AI as your assistant. And then lastly, I think global exposure is very important. What I've seen across many companies is there are only a few, even in GCCs, there are only few people who get exposure to the global organization or global, environments, right? So I think it's very important for everyone to have that exposure. So in our model, we promote or encourage our clients to be here, 2 or 3 times a year, different kind of people from different departments. So when they are here, our teams are interacting with them, collaborating with them, and that once that cross border hesitation, that we Indians usually have, goes away, I think you can create excellent environment for that thing. So I think these are the kind of strategies that we employ, and I think it's worked for our cause. But I think a lot of companies can take this forward and make a difference.
Right, Devesh, and I think today's talent, they are not just looking for jobs, but they're looking for more, in-depth meaning and flexibility and overall growth. And that's when, organizations should consider that and move beyond just transactional relationships and start building more genuine and human-centric workplaces. And I think, of course, you mentioned about technology, like, how AI is kind of reshaping the entire space, driving more personalized employee experience. And it's also kind of redefining what engagement really means. So I think as the workforce becomes more dynamic, with the evolving expectations, so the challenge is not just attracting the right talent, but it's consistently keeping them inspired and aligned with the organization's vision. Great. Devesh, I think in our entire conversation, we discussed so much about talent and GCCs, India's stand in terms of becoming a global player, fostering GCCs. So I think when we talk about GCCs and talent, I think the entire thing is not just a workforce issue, it's also the foundation of regional prosperity. So according to you, what does the future of work look like over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, not sure about 10, but I think in the next 5 years, definitely is AI augmented, is going to be skills first than what kind of experience you have, is going to be borderless. So, doesn't matter you're sitting in India or Germany or UK or US. I think, people need to have similar skills and similar attitude towards work. And I think GCCs are going to play an immense role or central role in this transformation for the next, I think, 5 years. So, yeah.
Definitely, Devesh. And as GCCs move closer to the core of business strategy, two factors become central, I believe. One is trust, but trust particularly, with global stakeholders and determines whether GCCs are seen as execution engines or strategic partners. And building this trust requires consistent delivery, deeper engagement, and the ability to move from transactional work to solution ownership. And the second key factor is leadership, because leadership pipelines emerge as a structural constraint sometimes. So I think leaders must be developed internally with context and credibility and, capability to navigate the global complexity and drive transformation. Well, thank you so much, Devesh, for taking out the time and effort to be on our podcast and, helping us understand that GCCs are now influencing the direction of business. The initial wave validated the model, the second wave refined operations, and now the third wave that we are currently witnessing is unlocking strategic values. So I think they're now actively shaping enterprise strategies and focusing more on strategic value creation. Thank you so much, Devesh, for your insights. It was lovely chatting with you.
Yeah, same here. Thanks a lot for having me. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. So, this is for our listeners. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion around GCCs and what incremental changes required in terms of fostering more GCC operations. It demands a fundamental redesign of talent models, organizational structures, and ways of working. Stay tuned for upcoming podcasts, and you can view all our previous episodes on Spotify and other leading platforms. Thank you so much.